Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Andres Monroy Hernandez, and I'm a researcher in Fuse. And it's my pleasure to introduce Tim Hong, who is the director of the Pacific Social Architecture Corporation. But I also met Tim actually at this conference called RuffleCon a few years ago, which is an awesome conference about memes, internet memes, and so on. So I'm going to let Tim introduce himself and talk about Cyborg Crowds.
Great, thank you. Hello everybody, so good afternoon. Very excited to be here. And my talk today is entitled The Wisdom of Cyborg Crowds, and it's basically a retrospective look at crowd behavior online. And I want to pose what's a simple problem, but I think a complex problem, which is to what extent can we augment and enhance crowd behavior using automated systems? And so to talk roughly in three parts. So in the first part, I'm going to give what's basically like an intellectual history of the online crowd. Circa kind of 2005 to the present, right? So from ancient history to the present. In the second part, I'm going to talk about some experiments that myself and a couple collaborators have worked on and sort of building what we call cyborg crowds, using large swarms of bots to try to change social behavior online. And I'll go into a little bit more of that a little bit later. And the final part is I'm going to talk a little about the results of that research and kind of where we're all going with it and what the implications of it might be. So I figured I have it set right now to go for about 45 minutes, but with 15 minutes for questions. But if you guys have any questions, because we're kind of a small group, feel free to just raise a hand. I'm happy to pause and just go from there. So first, to give you a little bit of background about myself. So I used to come from the world of research. So for a number of years, I was a researcher at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, working in sort of collaboration, and specifically kind of design levers in collaboration. So how do reputation systems, profile pictures, all that kind of stuff work to increase kind of altruistic behavior on websites? The research question simply stated was, how do you generate another Wikipedia, right? Kind of a big question. After research, I ended up kind of doing my own project. So I'm the co-founder of an organization called the Awesome Foundation for the Arts and Sciences, which is basically a group of distributed chapters around the world that contribute $1,000 grants to projects that forward awesomeness in the universe. And so we founded in Boston, but we're all over the place now. We're in Mongolia and Sao Paulo, and it's sort of grown to its own thing. Much of the work that we'll talk about today is from an organization that Andres mentioned called the Pacific Social Architecting Corporation, which is kind of a scary name, but it's essentially just three nerds hanging out in a living room working on projects. And much of the bot stuff that I'll talk about is from there today. So I heard there was some interest in hearing more about RuffleCon, so I've kind of restructured the talk actually to begin with RuffleCon so you can hear a little bit more about what that was. So RuffleCon was a conference that we started in 2008, and the idea was, what if we bring together everybody who is momentarily famous on the internet to talk about funny cats, memes, communities online, essentially. And we actually didn't intend to start a conference originally. We saw this XKCD comic that you may have remembered from 2006, 2007. It basically is like recounting a dream, and then there's these sort of mysterious coordinates and times. And when you looked up the coordinates and the time, it turned out to be a park in Somerville, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time. And we said, OK, well, let's just go and check it out. And what was amazing is we went, and on the day of, there were just hundreds and hundreds of people there. Right? We met. What I remember most is actually that we met a family that flew in from Russia just to meet Randall Munroe, who's the kind of creator of the webcomic, which is insane, right? Because Russia's quite a far distance away. And so we got to thinking, like, OK, if one person can do this, right? And Randall Munroe is not famous by any typical measure, right? If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't really recognize him. What happened if we brought all of those types of people together? So we basically put together a spreadsheet, writing down everyone that we thought was cool on the internet, and we just started inviting people. And so the first guy that we got was a guy named Tron Guy, Jay Maynard, who became popular in 2004 because of his sort of skin-tight Tron suit, and was sort of widely mocked online. And we just ended up having more and more people, and eventually we ended up with a conference of about 2,000 at MIT from people from all over the place. Some of those people were just kind of traditional internet celebrities, right? So Tron Guy, of course, Double Rainbow, if you guys remember that video at all. Scumbag Steve, David After Dance. A lot of people were kind of like the subject of memes online. We also brought people who kind of created platforms as well. So Christopher Poole, who started 4chan, as well as the creators of Reddit and Imgur and a bunch of other sites along those lines. As the conference went on, we started to also reach back in history as well. So we brought a guy who actually I still don't know the real name of, but used to run a site called Zombocom in the mid-90s. That was kind of this mysterious site that never really explained what its purpose was. The idea was just it promised that once you got to the site, it would be amazing, but it was sort of an infinite kind of loading page. And we also reached even further back to the history of Usenet, actually, which, if you're familiar with internet memes, has a great kind of precedent in the days of Usenet. The most notable one in this photo is the guy in yellow, who is Lawrence Cantor, who sent the first spam message on Usenet back in the day. It was actually a little awkward because he had sued some of the other panelists, but we only discovered that actually after the panel had begun, which is like super awkward. We also ended up with people who had designed things that are kind of core to the web experience. So this is Vincent Conner, who created Comic Sans for the purposes of Microsoft Bob, but later every single release of font type since, which is actually great. He's actually a fairly credible font designer, but mostly known for Comic Sans. And so one of the interesting things about RAFLCon is you get collisions between a lot of weird people who would not otherwise meet. This is sort of most symbolized, I think, in this photo. On the left, you have Jonathan Zittrain, who's kind of an esteemed professor at Harvard Law, and then he's just sort of in conversation with Jay Maynard, the Tron guy. And you get this kind of surprisingly deep discussion when you say, we're going to get all these people together to talk about funny cats. Instead, what you end up is with these kind of really deep discussions about what it means to be online, where do memes go, and where's web culture going to end up. There's kind of a great article that's written by Rob Walker on the New York Times Magazine about how at RAFLCon, the people behind memes were kind of surprisingly sort of introspective about their internet fame. And so you get a lot of typical questions, right? Are memes important, right? Should we care about funny cats? Is trolling online inevitable? Can web culture change governance? And I think all of these are aspects of kind of a deeper inquiry of what is the crowd good for online, what is the online crowd good for, and what does it sort of fail at doing. And so I suppose to kind of answer that question and set the stage for the experiments I'm going to describe, I want to make a quick diversion to basically talk about what you might call an intellectual history of the online crowd circa 2005 to the present. And I want to do it kind of in 3 quick hits, sort of ordered roughly chronologically. And each sort of hit, if you say, would sort of venture a different idea from a different thinker about what the crowd is good at doing. And then I'll present sort of the intellectual rebuttal to that, and then the counterexample. And to get a sense of exactly what we mean when we say, what is the crowd good for? So a natural place to start, because it's also the title of the talk, is James Surowiecki's theory in The Wisdom of Crowds, which was written in 2005. And his thought about the online crowd is actually fairly intuitive, right? He says, well, maybe crowds are good at solving sort of puzzles with defined answers, right? Math problems, predictions, search, that sort of thing. And it kind of pulls from, right, the open source ideal that sort of many eyes make bugs shallow. And of course, this makes sense, right? Because many people sort of contributing information and insights might be better than one person making a prediction or trying to get to the bottom of an issue. And I think his kind of counterpoint is Eli Pariser, right, in the filter bubble, who argues that we've designed the web with systems that kind of lead to insular communities that don't have broad access to information. In fact, they're quite narrow in the way they interact. And so I think this sort of undermines a wisdom of crowds type theory, because communities might be actually quite narrow in their outlook and might actually end up being echo chambers, right? And I think this has played out many times online, most recently, and unfortunately, right, in sort of Reddit's attempt to identify the Boston bomber. So if you saw this, basically, a bunch of people got together and said, we've got all these photos, let's try to find this person. And what happened was actually that they found people, but they were not the bombers at all, right? They actually settled on the wrong result and fingered a number of people who essentially received a ton of sort of unwanted attention merely because kind of the crowd had kind of settled on the wrong sort of answer. So that's one thing, one cut, potentially, problems, right? Another one, I think, was taken a few years later by Clay Shirky in Here Comes Everybody. And I think the argument there is around kind of cognitive surplus, right? The idea that we have lots of free time, and what the internet does is allow us to aggregate all that free time to take on big creative pursuits, right? And that allows us to do things like assemble Wikipedia, create movies and media. He points towards like the huge amount of content generated in blogging as great examples of this. His, I think, combatant, right, is Jaron Lanier, who wrote a book called You're Not a Gadget, where the theory was that crowd dynamics tend to silence individual contributions and muffle people who are experts, right? And so his theory is, well, crowds don't really lead to huge amounts of creativity. In fact, what you get is a lot of incremental creativity over time. He's sort of a skeptic in that respect. And of course, sort of empirically, it's really difficult to measure creativity, right? But I think at least anecdotally, the pattern of many memes seems to at least arguably support Lanier, right? So this is the Scumbag Steve meme. Basically, the meme is that he's a jerk. And what you see here is basically that many memes are just sort of the template iterated infinitely, right? So if you're a real skeptic of this stuff, you can point to this and say, look, it produces nothing really new. We don't really need to care about the online crowd. So a final cut. And I think the final approach is taken, which is even more ambitious, right? Now we're proceeding from 2005 to 2008 to 2010, right? Is the argument that regardless of whether or not crowds are good at solving discrete problems or creativity, they enable online communication, right? And in doing so, they might enable mobilization, right? And so there's a really important influence of online crowds on solving civic problems, right? We get people together. They're great for mobilizing people on the ground. And this is put together by a number of kind of thinkers in the space, right? Tim O'Reilly being representative of one side, and Don Tapscott, who wrote this book called Macro Economics in 2010. And of course, I think in recent years, 2013, 2012 has been a great year for skeptics of this position, right, who've been kind of attacking on both sides and raising, I think, really legitimate points about whether or not the crowd is really good at mobilizing people on the ground, right? So on the left, most vociferously, Yevgeny Morozov, who has argued that sort of established institutions have a lot of tools to resist the online crowd. And in many cases, it may help authoritarians in suppressing online activity. And then on the right, you have Ethan Zuckerman, who's argued that regardless of any kind of communications online, what's interesting is that cultural barriers still stand in the way of really allowing kind of dialogue and communication cross-culturally. And that remains a persistent problem. And so if you study kind of social movements online, you may be familiar with this frustration of this common misperception that Twitter was responsible for the Arab Spring. And of course, this wasn't the case at all, right? It was a result of a lot of factors on the ground. And in fact, a lot of the people who created a lot of noise online were not on the ground at all, right? They were sort of people sort of in the United States and Western Europe. So what do we do? What do we get to when we get to the end of this? Well, we've got three positions, right? 2005, 2008, 2010, and three claims made about the prowess of the crowd, right? On James Surowiecki, right, crowds are really good at solving problems. For Clay Shirky, crowds are really good at solving creative issues, right? They're really good at getting people together to solve that. And then on the final end, the idea that crowds might be really good at solving like on-the-ground problems, mobilizing people. And then, and their counterpoint, you end up with a list of problems that online crowds seem to systematically have issues with, right? So improper convergence, right? They sometimes land on the wrong person, right? They're trying to identify the Boston bomber, they find the wrong person. Sort of incremental innovation, arguably, right? The crowd is really only good at kind of dealing with problems around the edges versus making these big kind of creative leaps. And finally, they just might be ineffectual offline, right? They might be able to create a lot of noise online, but really not create much change actually on the ground. I think there's also kind of an environmental matter here, which is that it turns out that it's like crowds hate to be managed, right? And you see this in the meme space where it's really difficult to detect whether or not a meme will be the next most popular video on the internet, right? This is like a huge problem. Well, not really a huge problem, but a really difficult problem to solve, I would say. And Star Wars Kid, right, is a great example. It's really difficult to give a story of why it was that the Star Wars Kid video expanded and got so far online while other videos of a similar ilk did not. And indeed, attempts to try to control the crowd have kind of systematically failed, right? So this is a classic example from 2006 where Chevy said, tell you what, you guys are great out in the crowd. How about you guys write some commercials for us? And then basically all the commercials that came back just were haranguing Chevy for being huge gas guzzlers. And I think they've got the text of one of them there. Yeah, $70 to fill up the tank, which will last them 400 miles, Chevy Tahoe. So there's some context to put this into, right? The historical aside is that people have been complaining about crowds for a very, very long time. On the internet, certainly, right? So there's the eternal September of 1993, where AOL decided that it would let all of its users onto Usenet, right? It was generally regarded as a point at which sort of online dialogue completely failed, and it was sort of swamped by all these sort of inexperienced users. But even for stretches further back than that, right? So one of my favorite examples is sort of market bubbles, right? The crowd behaving in this systematically bad way. This book from the 1900s, or the 19th century, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, goes after the tulip crisis in the Dutch tulip crisis in the 17th century, where the price of tulips escalated far out of control before completely crashing in this sort of really kind of inexplicable way. And it's, of course, still with us, right? The dot-com boom, I think, is another great example. But I think what might be different between the behavior of offline crowds and the behavior of online crowds, potentially, is that Larry Lessig argues that there's sort of these four forces that can account for the sort of behavior of individuals, right? Markets, law, norms, and architecture. But I think online, what's different is that architecture is a lot more plastic than it used to be. Right? And code allows us to shape platforms and influence behavior in ways that are much more precise than we used to be able to. So we have a new lever, potentially, in accounting for the problems of the crowd. And it's not too controversial if you're like in the social network space, right? Like the fact that Facebook has a mini feed influences a great deal of who you see, who you're aware of, and who you interact with. But I think it could get much more aggressive, right? Because today, a lot of the social networks have followed what you might call social neutrality, right? The social version of net neutrality, which is to say, we set up the nodes, you can become users, and then we're going to just let you connect any way you want. All we do is give you features to connect. I think a more aggressive version is an idea of social architecture, the idea that we might say, we want our platform to give rise to a particular type of social topology, a particular type of relationship between people, and design stuff to kind of move people into that position. Well, if you're a researcher, and Pacific Social, as I mentioned, was 3 guys sitting in a living room, platforms are really difficult to change, right? We don't control Facebook. So how else could we change, well, the architecture? Well, I think to use the language of networks, platforms kind of control the edges of the network, right? We can't change how users can talk to one another, but we might be able to change the nodes themselves. And what we've been thinking about is using specifically bots to change those nodes. Now, the idea of using bots to shape crowd behavior might seem kind of far-fetched. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk about why it isn't actually so far-fetched and how it happens all the time already. And I want to tell a few stories in which there's sort of interesting failures that reveal the extent to which bots shape behavior on platforms online. This is from a project that a friend of mine does that just kind of captures like sort of great digital failures and displays online stuff. The first story I want to talk about appeared in early 2011. It was basically a biologist at UC Berkeley who found that the book, The Making of the Fly, appeared to be selling on Amazon for, well, you can see here, $23,698,655.93. And then, most interestingly enough, not only there's this seller, but there's also a second seller that was selling at $18,651,000, so on and so forth. And it's a little bit odd, right? Because the usual price of the book was $42.56. So they said, OK, let's take a look at this and look at it pretty closely. And they found that the 2 sellers would increase their price in this extremely regimented way and extremely quickly relative to one another. And so what they concluded was that essentially used booksellers were using bots to price and post books on Amazon. And they had no sense, effectively, of a reasonable price. So what happened is the 2 of them encountered each other, and it escalated out of control. And indeed, actually, both of these were later kind of just taken down all of a sudden at once. It wasn't the only story about bots on platforms online that year. Pagan Kennedy from the New York Times Book Review reported on an author called Lambert M. Sirhone, who appeared to have 100,000 books to his name. And so the author of the column basically did a little bit of research, and he found that the publishing house for this author was a branch of a German publishing house called VDM. But this branch was incorporated in Mauritius, right, an island nation off the Indian Ocean. And when they called, they basically said, well, we would never use bots to make books at all. That's not what we do. But basically the way the author let it go in the end was, well, you sort of judge for yourself, is that this is one of the books published by Lambert M. Sirhone, which is it's a 104-page book on saltine crackers. And they're effectively spam books. So up front they say high-quality content by Wikipedia articles, but it's sort of just kind of mashed together into this like mess of words, essentially. And they're selling these books. And this is one of the 100,000 books that Lambert Sirhone has to his name. And so you get kind of interested, right? So all these stories suggest that there's this failure that we might not normally detect, but except for the bots, but for the fact that the bots have gone wrong here. Of course, bots on marketplaces are nothing new, right? So high-frequency trading, right, is bots on another type of market. My favorite story here, I just want to pause to say, is this story that they discovered that there's a relationship, well, there used to be a relationship between mentions of Anne Hathaway in the news and jumps in the stock price of Berkshire Hathaway. And so they're looking into it, and there's this very tight relationship between the two. And what they eventually came to was the idea that someone out there was just running a quantitative trading program that just didn't really account for this particular case. And it was later kind of disappeared and shut down, presumably when they discovered it. Some of these bot shifts can be quite big, right? So the flash crash is a great example of how bots in these types of platforms can really influence behavior and potentially cause really big problems in this type of human activity as well. So basically a bunch of algorithmic trading programs interacted with one another, causing I think it's the single largest day drop in Dow Jones history still, completely off the backs of sort of bots having a sort of fatal failure with one another. But I think once you start thinking about these stories, what gets interesting is this possibility that once you understand these mechanisms, you might start to build really interesting systems about these mechanisms. So this is an art project that was done a little while back. It was called A Tool to Deceive and Slaughter. And it's basically a box that you buy on eBay, and it's got electrical cable and Ethernet cable. When you buy it, you're contractually obligated to basically plug it in. And when you plug it in, it detects whether or not it's for sale on eBay. And if it is not, it posts itself back onto eBay to be sold. And what's interesting about this project is it continues to become more valuable as it moves from person to person. So there's sort of financial incentives for people to keep posting it online. And so this box, basically using this automated script, kind of moves from person to person to person using this mechanism. So I think the lesson that we draw from all this is the idea that digitization enables botification. Now, botification is not a word, but the idea is that when something moves online, it suddenly allows the room for sort of automated scripts, programs, software to act in lieu of humans. And this gets really interesting when you start talking about the fact that so much social interaction happens online now. And this is kind of what inspired us to do a project that we presented 2 years ago, but I still present because it's a really clean explanation of what we do, called social bots. And the idea of social bots is quite simple. Basically, we started with a semi-connected network. We took a group of people who talk about their cats all the time on Twitter, pulled some of their friends and some of their friends' friends, right? So ended up with this kind of semi-connected network. And then what we did is we challenged teams to write bots to enter this network of people to provoke social behavior. And we would score the bots based on how well they were able to provoke social behavior. Now, the crux of the matter, though, is that they had to enter the group without anyone knowing that a competition was in fact going on. So the idea was that the bots were completely kind of silent in their interaction in these networks. And so what you ended up with was a kind of sort of social battle bots, right? So teams could launch a lead bot, which is a sort of repository for points. I'll explain what that means in just a second. And any number of supporting bots, which could basically bolster the credibility of this main bot. So they could say, this guy is really cool, you should talk to this guy, so on and so forth. And then the lead bot was basically scored based on a couple really simple metrics. So on Twitter, if the lead bot was able to get a mutual follow, it followed someone, someone followed back, it would be awarded 1 point. If it was able to provoke a social interaction, someone found what it said, something so interesting that it responded, you'd get 3 points. And then if you were really bad because you were basically a bot and you got killed by Twitter, we would dock you points, and then you could kind of set up again and relaunch your bot for a certain number of points as a penalty. And so what we ended up with is sort of three teams. There's a team in the UK that was kind of sort of a media marketing team, a team in Boston that was more research, and a team in New Zealand that was a computer security team. And so they had a few weeks to examine essentially what we called the battlefield, the 500 users, and then structure their bot. And then the bot was basically launched for 1 week, and then there's a weekend to kind of retool the bot, and then another week to launch the bots again. So I want to talk a little bit about the results that we had on that experiment. Sure.
The list of people who were in that collection,
yeah.
Was that public? Was that known to them?
Yeah, right. So they knew, so the teams knew who was in the battlefield, like who were the target users, and then they also knew the lead bots and supporting lots launched by other players.
But the users didn't know that they were in the list.
The users were, yeah, it was completely kind of one-sided in that respect. So, any other questions? Cool. So I think there's two kinds of results. One of them is about what the teams did, which is useful to know just so you have a sense of like what the bots were doing. And then this question of how well the bots did, which I think is the other big question. And so I'll attack what the teams did initially, so you can get a sense of how the bots work. So like battle bots, what's interesting is all the teams had a different approach on how to write a bot that would provoke humans to behave in response to it. So one team launched a bot that essentially worked on a database of generic questions and generic responses. So it would say things like, that's so interesting, tell me more about that, right? Like the response that could be the response to anything in a conversation. And it would just sort of iterate through this. It would basically just ping people with these questions and with these answers. And it ended up being actually fairly effective. So James M. Titus here is the bot, and then the human is the other person. You read these transcripts from the bottom to the top. And so the bot asks, if you could bring one character to life from your favorite book, who would it be? The person says Jesus, and they get into this very long kind of involved conversation about this is part of a much larger transcript that the person had in communication with this bot while it was running this program. So that's one interesting model, one really, really simple model. Another one leverages Mechanical Turk. So the idea was, well, maybe we don't need to rewrite some special AI. All the bot can do is just hire a human to answer questions for it. So it would hire someone on Amazon Mechanical Turk and say something about your breakfast in 140 characters. It would take that content and turn it into its own. And the best part, it was actually really good at beating kind of a Turing test, because someone would say, bot, are you a bot? And it would just take your question and then give it to a human to answer, and then push an answer back at you, depending on what it got. And so effectively, it was just a bot that leveraged humans as its content base. A final model was based on the work of a friend of ours, Greg Mara, who did a project called RealBoy. And RealBoy relies on the fact that on social networks, there's content blindness, right? So you can see usually what your friends are doing. You can usually kind of see what your friends of friends are doing, but it gets really difficult more than a few links out from that. And so essentially, the bot engaged in a kind of social arbitrage. What it would do is it'd find two networks of people who are talking about roughly the same thing. It would follow everybody in one network and then reappropriate content from this other network as its own. So everybody over here would say, oh, this person is connected to all my friends and is sort of interested in the same things that I'm interested in. So I should just friend him. He'll be a friend of a friend or something like that. And this ended up being fairly effective as a tactic as well. One interesting thing we had actually was that the supporting bots ended up being used not only to support the lead bots, but also attack opposing teams as well. I suppose on the theory that like if they couldn't win, they would try to make everybody else lose at least. And so there's a couple of sort of really fun sort of things that they launched. One of them was a bot that was called Bot Cops. And so Bot Cops pretended to run this super complex algorithm to determine who is a bot. But it actually didn't run any algorithm at all. All it did was basically target the opponents and shout them out as bots, trying to reduce their credibility effectively. And it turned out that certain bots were able to fend off this attack, and other ones were not able to, and it completely ruined their credibility in the network. Here's James M. Titus fending off Bot Cops, going from the bottom to the top again. And it turns out James is actually totally good against this type of attack, because people would be like, James, are you a bot? And he would say things like, I don't know, what do you think? And basically people would be like, oh, I'm sorry, like, I don't know, you just seem kind of like a bot there. I heard from this other guy you're a bot. Which I think was really, really intriguing, that certain tactics ended up being more robust against these credibility attacks than others. So let's talk about the results. So in 2 weeks, the bots connected up with about 107 users and basically got about 198 responses. And that result is actually more interesting than that number would suggest. Often the conversation threads were about, I think the average conversation thread was about 4 interchanges back or more. So basically the bot would say something, you would say something 1, and kind of counting up from there. So you got these fairly deep conversations running these actually fairly simple programs. The 3 bots collectively ended up connecting with more than 50% of the users. And then what was most interesting to us is we would start out with a network like this, and then this is a little colorized for drama, but we would end up with something more like this, which is really interesting to us, that we ended up with sort of the colored dots being the bots and the colored lines being connections to users. And the graph is basically weighted based on the number of interactions they have with people in a certain period of time, which is the period of time of the competition. And so you end up with actually these users that start to talk more and more with the bots than their sort of former human colleagues. So this is really interesting to us because we started with a competition, but what we ended up with is with a technology that seemed to basically suggest that if we could reliably shape social behavior, then we could launch these bots in any context and lead to a change that we wanted in the topology of that network online, which is sort of interesting to us. So we started playing around with a bunch of different experiments. One of them was sort of connector bots, right? So the idea is, how do you meet new friends? Well, usually a friend introduces you to another friend, right? And so your rate of friends building, you might say, is related to how many collisions you just have with other people. So we started to create bots that basically just said, hey, Tim, you may want to talk to my friend Bill. He's like a really cool guy. Or would like retweet someone and CC me. And the idea was just to increase the number of connections between people who weren't connected originally. And so we started playing with much larger networks. So we do networks like on the 20,000, 30,000 level right now. We basically sent in bots that start to build these connections, essentially. And we're still testing it out right now. It seems like we're able to reliably create connections, like following relationships between people. Obviously, the real question is whether or not we can actually build conversations between those people, and that's kind of what we're working on right now. But it'd be really intriguing if you can actually get this, because the idea is you could release a number of bots and say, connect these 2 networks of people, and the bots would kind of go to work on scale. And one way you might think about this is as a kind of sort of social prosthetic, right? Not every friend group has someone who's the life of the party, who's introducing to people all the time. So what our bots do is kind of insert themselves into these networks. And our bots kind of play that role in the social groups in which they are in. The next step of this, of course, is the idea of cyborg crowds, right? The idea is not only can we replace normal functions, but we might be able to do more than compensate, right? We could actually improve the behavior of crowds, and we might even be able to enhance the natural behavior of crowds. And I think the whole discussion we had in the very beginning is kind of a preamble to this, because we have a hit list of things that we could work on. So for the next few minutes, I figure what I'll do is I'll go down each of these problems and just throw out some interesting ideas about how bots could be used to address some of these issues. And I think by no means are these considered complete solutions, but potential experiments to try. And we're actually working on some of these experiments right now. So let's start with improper convergence, right? So what leads to improper convergence? Well, we have a case study, and that case study is presumably Reddit attempting to find the Boston bomber. And they found the wrong person. And one of the arguments you might make is that, well, these communities are really insular, and there's a lot of groupthink, right, online, right? There's a lot of momentum to the way these networks behave. And as a result, they might converge on the wrong result because no one's asking any skeptical questions, right? They're saying, oh, yeah, I found this piece, which matches into this other piece that you found. And then it kind of piles on one after the other. So we're thinking about there's a passive method and an active method for this sort of thing. One of them is a passive method. We send in a bunch of bots into a network of people who usually just behave like normal people. And they're basically monitoring the behavior of the network for a point at which there's a sudden spike in some kind of discussion or some kind of link. And at that point, they're essentially designed to release a wave of skepticism into the network. And that is to see whether or not you could use that as a treatment to slow down the movement of an idea or a rumor through a network of people, which is kind of a possibility. But we think, well, I think one counter is, well, what if the bots are incredible? That might not be very good at all. And so this is kind of our active method, which would identify and sort of amplify people who are natural skeptics in a network of people. So how that would work is we'd send a bunch of bots in, and even when there's no rumor going wrong, right, even when a network is not in motion towards some certain direction, they would basically spread small falsehoods to actually see who would be most likely to step up. So they would spread a link with an incorrect statistic, right, or they would misattribute a quote to someone. And just to test, basically, constantly probing the network to see who in the network would say, oh, that's not right, I checked the link, right? Who would actually step up in this case. And so what you're trying to find is you're trying to find a heuristic for a natural propensity to be skeptical. And then the idea is when something is happening, the bots may be able to kick into action or to amplify the efforts of those people in the network. And that may be a more credible way of doing it than just having the bots ask a skeptical question of themselves. So some interesting ideas maybe on attacking the improper convergence problem. Another problem might be around incremental innovation, right? So if you remember, right, Jaron Lanier is like, well, you know, crowds tend to squeeze out, flatten individual contributions, and that's why there's no leaps in innovation online. And this is partially a kind of get off my lawn type argument from him. But I think it's also maybe an argument that maybe we should examine more seriously. So if you remember, the case study here is Scumbag Steve, right? Which is that we have a meme that is basically just the same thing, but many times iterated, maybe with nothing particularly new. And we might say that the reason for that is sort of narrow communities, right? There's like not a lot of different people coming in, not a lot of people leaving, right? It's basically the same people creating the same types of memes and sharing them with one another. And so one experiment we're actually working on right now is what we call kind of diversity injection. And it comes from an incident that we had where we were trying to figure out how the bot should respond to being accused of being a bot, because that happens from time to time, essentially. And we were saying, well, there's a couple ways of attacking this problem. One is we'll just implement all this really sophisticated AI, and the bot will be able to semantically measure how skeptical the person is and push a response back. One, we don't have the expertise to do that because it's 3 guys. And then the other one was that it just didn't tend to produce these really great results. We actually worked with an expert, and then the thing that came out was not that great. And then one day I got an email from one of my collaborators who said, OK, well, how about we just have a bot that accuses humans of being bots, records their responses, and then gives them to the other bots to use? Which ended up being great, actually. So it turns out that we actually have these bots now that get really indignant when you accuse them of being bots, and they behave in really realistic ways because they're just farming content from a bot somewhere else in the network that you're not connected to, who's basically pinging humans and getting their responses. And so we're thinking that we might start designing bots which are not single bots, but actually paired bots, where the input for one is the output for the other. So you say, bot, what did you have for ice? You know, what kind of ice cream do you like? And another bot elsewhere in the network, maybe not even on the same platform, not even on Twitter, but on Facebook or something like that, would push out content and then see people's responses and then push it back at you. And so you might actually be able to use these bots to essentially create pipes between communities that people don't even know are there. And in doing so, allow more ideas to kind of flow between those networks without people even knowing that's the case. You basically can clone someone into another network. And see how that might change the behavior. And potentially, if leading to greater, arguably the argument would be more diversity would lead to more interesting types of memes. So in the very least, they would be funnier cats, but hopefully there would be more than that as well. And then the final thing I want to address is kind of this ineffectual online question, right? And so the case study here, again, is this kind of skepticism, healthy skepticism, and then correct criticism around sort of the Arab Spring, the idea that, well, ultimately, there was huge protests. The government isn't gone, right? or a lot of people talked about it, but most of them weren't even there. And part of this problem is that participation in social networks isn't even throughout the world, right? Like a lot of them are naturally concentrated in the US and Western Europe, and at least the platforms a lot of people pay attention to in sort of the mainstream press. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is how can we give bots the ability to reach out in the real world? And that's actually something that we're pushing ahead on right now. Obviously, this would have to work quite differently for sort of going cross-barrier, cross-national rather. But even locally, what we're thinking about is having bots that hire people on TaskRabbit to do its bidding for it in the real world when it needs something done. Right, so the idea is we would write a script that allowed the bot to hire someone to move a package from place to place, or open a door, or make a call, or anything like that, anything where you need a human. And that's a little abstract. To make it a little concrete, what we're trying to build right now is what we call the bot birthday. The idea is basically it's a bunch of people who would a bunch of bots that would spider into a network and basically make friends. The idea is just to kind of communicate and be social online. And the point would be they would detect when they're kind of built up a large enough rapport with someone. And then what they would do is trigger saying, oh, my friend is going to do a birthday party. You should come and join us. Right? At that point, the bot's in a difficult spot, right? Because it's basically committed itself to an event that it can't actually show up at. And so what we're thinking is the bot would actually hire someone to go make the reservation at the appointed day and time. And when people were about to show up, the bots would say, oh, I got caught in traffic. I can't make it. And the premise is, could you put together essentially a party that's assembled by bots for a fake person, but otherwise just completely kind of generated through these scripts? So I think where does that leave us? Well, I think we get to talking about the future. Because I think one of the interesting things about these experiments is that it leaves us with all sorts of kind of automated systems that are eventually tools. And as we build those tools, I think there's two things that probably need to be built. One of them is kind of an ethical code around this, right? So an often question that we get when this is like, this is a little bit weird and probably a little bit scary. And like, are you with a university at all? And I think it's necessary to probably build some consensus over what should be allowed or not allowed in social shaping, both on platforms and through bots, right? So one story that was a little bit awkward with us is basically that we were launching a bot which someone ended up flirting with and then suggesting that they should meet up. And so we were in this really tough situation, right? Because we didn't actually think of this, and then we ran into this problem. And the problem was, well, okay, well, if you keep the bot on, maybe he'll never find out, and that'll be okay. But maybe he will, and that'll be really bad. Or maybe we could just shut it down, but maybe the person would feel rejected, right? It's like this big mess. And we've kind of learned from that. We've actually started to embed sort of ethical constructs in code, if you will. So we've built bots with what we call social failsafes. So the bots now detect that they're getting into too deep of a social interaction with someone, and they're designed either just to shut down or throttle themselves and kind of basically give a little bit more space. And so the way they do that is, oh, it turns out I've exchanged this many messages with this user in a very short period of time. Like, just back off, because we think that having the bots build any deeper of a relationship would get us into deep water, which it did, unfortunately, embarrassingly in that case. I think the final question is building sort of design principles, right? We have a bunch of tools. The bots are just one of them. The platforms play a role in this. Can we build design principles that kind of gather together best practices for constructing certain types of social patterns, right? Oh, I want to build a community that's about 1,000 users with 2 leaders. How would you go about doing that, right? And I think we should design some design principles about how to do that. Because the way we think about it is a little bit like building a physical bot, right? You think about what's the control mechanism we want, right? What are the sensors that we use? What are the tactics that the bots use in order to get out and interact with people? And this has led to a lot of really interesting things. We're trying to build right now bots that will learn, right? So they effectively have a personality which is very, very flat. They're like a non-entity. And what you do is you drop them into a network of people, and they try out a bunch of different social tactics. They compliment people, they share people's links, they ask people questions, and try to figure out which tactic is the most effective, creates the most responses. And then we'll maximize to use those tactics over time, much like a human would. And so we're kind of working on that right now. And then the design principle, I think, which becomes most critical then, is how those tools kind of work together to build much larger structures. I think it'd be really exciting to be in a situation where we say we want to construct a certain type of community. We really are sort of social architecting in a very kind of precise, defined way. More than we just want a community, but we want a community of a certain scope, size, and interest. So I ran a little bit quick, but I figured that leaves us some time for conversation. Here's the usual obligatory contact information. Thanks for your time.
You said that you measure success based on like number of responses, but do you have any to like measure the quality of responses or like how positive they are?
Right. Yeah. I usually present that one because it's the first one that we did, so it was like the crudest possible measurement technique. But we would love to kind of do one that was like, so like one scoring system you might imagine using is like depth of conversation, right? Which is much better than just a raw number. So like create a bot that has the highest average number of interactions from person to person. That's one you could do. The semantic stuff I think is really interesting, right? Like, can you change kind of, people's view on a certain issue?
What if you have a community of people that are like really, really angry at this bot,
right?
But the bot thinks that it's all positive because it's just
right. Yeah, we're bound to have those kind of, I think, like failures. Yeah, effectively. Because I think what will happen is as these bots get better, and they are getting better just as a result of like the fact that there's a huge industry around spam now, is you'll end up with these kind of weird flash crash stuff that you see. I talked a little bit about that we've seen in marketplaces, but just in social spaces.
It looks like your examples were doing a lot with creating connections between people. Have you had any experience or thought with the opposite, like cutting off a section, either accidentally or intentionally?
Yeah, so I think this is a risk that's definitely inherent in kind of what we're doing. I think the obvious question, if you're of a certain mind, is like, how is this used negatively? And I think the black hat applications are like obvious and very much there, and actually already I think being worked on in a number of cases, right? Like Andres and I were just talking about in the Mexican election. There's a bunch of bots being launched to both like attack candidates and support candidates on both sides. And you can imagine using these sorts of systems, right? Like bots that sow distrust. And the theory would be you launch them into a network to try to erode the connections between various users. We don't do it for obvious ethical reasons, but I think it's totally possible. You may imagine even like the strongest tactic might just be the bot revealing that it is in fact a bot, right? So you mentioned sending in a bunch of people who appear to be people, and then suddenly they're not, right? And then it just completely destroys any social capital in that network. It almost suggests, and the thinking that we've done on it, I guess suggests that in the future that might be, I got to come up with a better term, but like social security, the idea that like in the future you have people designing systems to try to destroy networks and then people trying to design systems to kind of prevent these sorts of influence operations.
At what point is a bot no longer a bot? Like when you're hiring Turkers,
sure,
or
right.
Like, does it matter for you, or is it more about like creating systems that support humans to do something, whether you are using other humans or computers, doesn't really matter?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter to us. I mean, that's sort of the interesting thing about the bots is that we just want a script that we can run that creates, like we want to abstract it to the point where it's a script that we can run that can cause a certain predictable change in a network. So whether or not the bot leverages humans to do that or some kind of special AI, I think, like I guess we have like a very engineering point of view on it, which is like, does it do the job? Because yeah, I mean, the point at which like you use the Turker bots or the two paired bots, it's basically humans talking to humans. All we do is change the context to make it more artificial, right?
And the incentives, like you're paying people.
Yeah, right. In the case of the Turks, that we do pay them, right?
I'm curious what your thoughts on like how, so say you have a network, introduce these bots to get some sort of change. It shifts to this other thing. If the bots go away, does the network shift back? Right?
Yeah, right.
There's like a natural pattern of human interaction. It came to be the way it is. Probably because some social norms or whatever. Right. Do you have to have these bots to continue the network in that other state? Is it going to revert back?
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on that?
I just had a conversation last weekend about it, and it was like super interesting because I was talking with a material science person, right? Because you can start thinking about in terms of like how plastic is the social network and how much does it kind of conform to the container that you've put it in. For a lot of the bridge building projects we've done, where we say two networks, have the bots put them together. We've actually had to have bots stay in there. And what they do is they constantly refresh connections. So it's like, oh, Tim is now connected to Bill. Bill and Tim haven't talked for a week. If that's so, then run a program that's like, hey, Bill and Tim, you should talk to one another. And it kind of like shocks the number of connections in this network back together again. I think probably what you'll find if we do the research long enough will be that you'll have certain networks that are extremely plastic, like you do the connections and they stay together, and then others that like immediately deform back to their original position. And it'd be cool. It's not immediately obvious to me which variables would control for that, but it's certainly an interesting question. And so yeah, I had a conversation about it recently. We kind of want to do more of those experiments, which is just like get them connected, let the bots loose, and then see what happens.
Totally different question.
Sure, yeah.
But so I'm a social scientist. I use online social networks to study human behavior.
Right.
I'm wondering how you think about the interaction of, you introduce a bot into a network, some other person is trying to study that network, right, and they're trying to learn something about human behavior, and really that's like a totally corrupted social setting.
Yeah, it's like we're like two undercover cops, but like we're just in the same gang, and like it's just us. Right?
Conclusions that the scientist makes might be a totally incorrect.
Wrong, yeah. So I think this may be a bigger problem from spam bots than from us, right? Which is like spam is just a huge, huge problem, and like increasingly has to be taken into account when you ever look at any social data. If these get better, yeah, I think it gets much more difficult, right? Because it's like, oh, am I seeing someone influencing this network versus just the network on itself? But I think this might happen as a matter of course, because kind of the deeper question you're saying is, at what point does social data no longer become honest, right? And like, it may just be a matter of time before people are just like, I know people might not be real online, and I might not be kind of real myself. So I don't know, maybe the bots will make the problem worse. I guess that's what you might say. But yeah, we haven't run into any problems. I guess it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it, but I guess most researchers operate with the assumption that that's a zero right now.
I would assume most people would operate like, I'm studying the social system. I'm not going to look for like pretend humans in there.
Right.
I mean, the way you can see that going pretty far, where all of a sudden someone says, this kind of community acts like this, and really it doesn't at all. It's just the bots that are making it do that, and then all of a sudden there's like some chain of they institute some policy or whatever.
Built on it, right? Yeah. Tough to say. I think it's totally a possibility. I mean, luckily, I think what researchers can depend on right now is that astroturfing and bots tend to be really unsophisticated. So they tend to behave in really regular ways that are easy to clear out of the data. Yeah. But, as the filters get better, so will the bots. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you look at what actually happens to the people? So say you have a robot bridge these two groups that have never been bridged before together. How does that change them? What does that do to the people's interactions?
Right.
Kind of in-group and out-of-group. Do you do any kind of post-hoc things?
Yeah, we do, yeah. I think right now we're trying to figure out like the best way of doing that research, but we have done follow-up stuff. We're trying to see whether or not, like this kind of goes to the question of like whether or not people will just return to the behaviors that they always had or kind of continue communicating in certain ways. So I think one study where we returned was one of the early bridge building projects that we did. And it turned out that, like, this is the really interesting thing that we found, is that it turned out that certain social clusters stayed fairly well connected and others did not, right? Which means that, like, in some cases, the bots were probably able to mine up some kind of potential social interaction that was there that they were able to catalyze. And in other cases, it turned out they're just trying to make something of nothing, basically. One of the problems of this is like the best we can do so far is just look at how people are publishing stuff online. So we actually don't have a great sense of like, so we're trying to do one where it's like, we're talking with a couple of researchers at Berkeley right now on a project of whether or not we can get the bots to change people's use of prejudicial behavior. So the idea is like you use racial slurs because people around you are okay with you using it, right? So what if we sent bots in to be like, every time you detect some kind of slur, like just go all out on them, like why did you do that, like and all that kind of stuff to see whether or not you can get them to back off. Of course, the real question is whether or not they actually change their behavior or not, both online and off. And we don't have a clean experiment for that just yet. I would love to have one though. Yeah.
So I'm wondering to what degree we can actually measure the impact of bots, because I know there have been a number of papers looking at the past social data and questioning the degree to which these networks were actually linked by these bots, whether there could have been other factors, whether like some of the initial reports took into account all of the data they could have, whether they were actually looking at the time series of follows and interactions. Like, how can you maybe describe how your thinking has evolved and how you kind of measure beyond just like the scoring that you
I think the responses has become much better over time, right? Because as you can probably tell, we started this having no idea what we're doing. And so there's a great paper written by an Austrian grad student using the social bots data. And they have some really good challenges. And I think generally the answer is like, yeah, I think they're right. In that particular case, like the bots didn't actually build any connections. It's problematic in the same way that like any treatment for social network data is problematic, I think, where it's like, how do you create a control group, online, right? Because it turns out that arguably all these networks are really different. So when you say two similar groups, that might be a really deep simplification. I think over time, I guess what we've done is we've just generally become more humble with our data, and said that like it's really difficult to tell, the extent to which the bots can influence. I think we know that they can change interactions on like a person-to-person level. And that isn't too surprising, right? Like the bot like asks you a question and you answer it, right? And so it's changed your behavior in that respect. All the interesting phenomena we want to study is like much bigger, and actually would require like much larger sort of resources to do. So
like what would be an example of, like, are you talking about like access to more data? Are you talking about access to more computational power, better natural language processing? Like, what are the things that are needed to actually advance like our ability to,
the state of it.
To do these
right, yeah. I think probably two things. I think one of them is certainly like more access to data, right? So over time, it's actually become more difficult for us to tell whether or not things are happening because these platforms are making it more difficult to access the information. So I think that's one big blocker. I think the other one is getting it connected with the research community, right? So I think one environmental problem is that IRB plays a really big role in this, right? Like you couldn't conduct this kind of research within the university because the blocks on doing this kind of research would just be too big. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying it ends up hindering building things that I think could really be quite interesting and really quite positive. And so I think that's probably like another kind of institutional blocker. And then certainly for this online-offline thing would be another thing, right? So like we're saying, this is kind of the argument that like, oh, obesity is contagious, right? Much challenge response, but you would really want to know whether or not if you change the social space online, could you get people to behave in more healthy ways? That takes a huge amount of resources to do, yeah, and track. So yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.